Hey Russell, I can't get Skype to work. Can you send me an invite? You're not able to? Okay. Russell, I got something going. You want to see if you can find it? Good morning to those joining us on the telephone. Please remember to mute your end of the phone. Thank you so much. Again, good morning to those joining on the phone. Please remember to mute your end of the phone. Thank you so much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you and good morning. Thanks for your patience. Our colleague, Supervisor Cortese, is on his way. He's been just delayed a very brief bit, but will join us shortly. And we're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order as a committee of the whole. That would mean we have all one of two members present and accounted for. I'm Supervisor Joe Simidian. Let me see first if we do have public comment at this time. I'm looking to the clerk of the board, who indicates that we do not. So that takes us to item 3, which is to approve the consent calendar. And we have a modest consent calendar today, but which consists of just the minutes, but we'll wait until my colleague is able to join us. We will start with verbal reports from the chair and the vice chair. And again, the vice chair is on his way. I do not have anything to share today. So that means we get to move directly into the verbal reports from the Office of the County Executive relating to items of interest to the task force. And I see that we have representatives from both the County Executive's office and the County Counsel's office in their absence, tending to other county business. So let me turn to the County Counsel's office, ask you to introduce yourself, Mr. Herzog, and see what, if anything, you have to share before we move on to our other items.
Sure. Gary Herzog, Deputy County Executive. Danielle Christensen will be giving the report today for the County Executive's office.
All right. Anything, Ms. Christensen, you'd like to share with us?
Yes, thank you. Danielle Christian, Legislative Manager. Just very briefly, I wanted to share, no surprise to the members of the task force, that the House's impeachment inquiry has been the topic of focus in Washington, D.C. Of late, as reported in the media, amid allegations that President Trump abused his power by pressuring Ukraine to investigate one of his political rivals. House Speaker Pelosi opened a formal impeachment inquiry. The allegations were first disclosed in a whistleblower's complaint and are now at the center of the House impeachment inquiry. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff is leading an investigation into the whistleblower's allegations. Along with 5 other committees, he will provide information about potential articles of impeachment to the House Judiciary Committee, which will then decide whether to forward any to the House for a vote. Basic process here: if a majority of the representatives support even a single article, the president is impeached. But impeachment itself does not mean removal from office. The Senate would then hold a trial to determine whether to convict the president and remove him from office. If at least 2/3 of the senators find the president guilty, he is removed, and the vice president takes over as president, and there is no appeal. On a timeline, the House Speaker has stated that she wants the investigation to move expeditiously. Democratic leaders have hinted that it will take weeks, a few months at most. We've got Prime Policy Group on the line here, as well as Burt Margolin. They've both been asked to be prepared to speak about the impact the impeachment proceedings are currently or may have on Congress's legislative work.
Thank you for that, Ms. Christian. And let me just ask, Prime, is this a good point for us to jump to you? On this topic in particular, I see that we have an agenda item for comments regarding the federal budget and the appropriations process in a moment, and I know that that too has the potential to be affected by impeachment proceedings, but I do think it'd be helpful at this point just to take a minute or two to hear from you all what the initial thinking is, understanding that it's still early days, about the potential impact of the impeachment proceedings on matters of interest to the task force.
Sure. This is Rich Mead from Prime Policy, and I'll start and allow my colleagues to jump in. As you mentioned, still sort of early in this process, and we don't know how much of an impact the impeachment will have on the legislative process. Both my colleagues Marty and I were on Capitol Hill in 1998, the last time our country went through this process. And ironically, in 1998, even though a slightly different process for looking at the articles of impeachment back then it was focused just in the Judiciary Committee and not involving the other committees. But nevertheless, in 1998, Congress was actually fairly productive around the impeachment, with impeachment sort of overhanging. They completed the appropriations process in its entirety by October 21st. A number of significant bills went through that fall, including reauthorization of the Economic Development Administration, an omnibus parks bill, Patent and Trademark Office reauthorization of the Perkins Vocational and Applied Technology Education Act, and many more significant bills. So the last time there was a balance between what was going on in the impeachment process and what was happening through the legislative process. And Marty, I don't know if you want to add any further color to that.
No, other than whether they did it intentionally or not to make progress, they didn't vote on the impeachment until pretty much as they were finishing up the Congress. It was in December of '98. And as a matter of fact, it had to straddle the next Congress. They had to reappoint their House managers, and then the Senate received them in January of '99, beginning of the next Congress. And they spent about 5 weeks in the Senate on it from like January 7th, and they voted on February 12th. There were 2 articles that made it through the House, and neither got a majority. One failed 50-50, and the other failed 45 to 55. Unfortunately, this is moving rapidly, it seems, at the moment. And even though Pelosi just had a press conference saying, she still wants to work with them on trade and on drug pricing, emergency billing, or whatever, the president then came out swinging a few moments ago and saying that she can't work on anything. She's so wrapped up in this. He's, I think he's going to be preoccupied. It's going to be difficult. They may be able to get the trade agreement done. The cooler heads prevail in the administration, but we'll see. And then the appropriations process is they still have to resolve the allocations and the wall issue.
Thank you. Any other comments from Prime before I turn elsewhere for a moment? No. I don't know if Mr. Margolin is on the phone yet.
I am. I'm here.
Thanks, Mr. Margolin and the folks at Prime, and we'll try and make sure everybody gets heard here. So if I were to summarize both what was shared this morning and also what I've been hearing from other sources and certainly reading and listening to, lots of uncertainty, candidly, about how the impeachment process does or does not affect the legislative agenda. Conventional wisdom is that it's likely to get in the way of legislative action / progress by Congress. Possibly good news in that things can't be done to us, possibly bad news in that things can't be done for us. So with all of that on the one handing and on the other handing I've just offered, does that sound like sort of where people are at the moment in terms of assessing what the coming months might look like in terms of activity in the Congress?
I think that's a fair summary.
All right. So, ask us 3 months from now and we'll tell you what happened, I think is kind of where we're going to be on this one from, a set of circumstances that are, if not unique, at least unconventional. Ms. Christian, anything else? I do want to recognize and thank my colleague, Supervisor Cortese, for joining us as well, and I was remiss in not recognizing the representative from Congressman Khanna's office, Mr. Pike, who's with us, which we appreciate as well. Ms. Christian, back to you.
Thank you. That was the full report.
Okay. All right. Supervisor Cortese, welcome. I'm going to summarize by saying we live in interesting times. That's about the extent of where I think we are, with some expectation that it's going to be hard to predict and or work with any certainty in the congressional arena given the current impeachment proceedings. I will go back, before I go to County Counsel in just a moment, I will go back to item number 3, which is the consent calendar. The only item we have on the consent calendar today is to approve the minutes. So let me just ask Supervisor Cortese if you are prepared to offer a motion to approve the minutes and the consent calendar.
Yes, so moved.
Thank you very much. And without objection, hearing none, so ordered. Done. Thank you. All right, that takes us then to the County Counsel's office, and that's item number 6 for a report from the Office of the County Counsel relating to items of interest to the task force.
Kavita Narayan, Office of the County Counsel. I have 3 updates that are so new they're not even on the grid.
Okay.
The first one is that the county filed as you know, lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's rule relating to public charge back in August. We also filed a preliminary injunction motion a couple of weeks ago. An argument on that motion is happening as we speak in the Oakland Federal Courthouse. The effort is to try and preliminarily enjoin the rule from going into effect on October 15th. So tight timeline there, and we will keep you posted about the results of that argument. The second one is, as the board is well aware, the county also submitted a comment on the FCC's repeal of net neutrality regulations back in December of 2017. Yesterday, the D.C. Circuit Federal Court of Appeals issued a long opinion. On the one hand, unfortunately, they upheld the FCC's repeal of strict net neutrality regulations. But on the other hand, they also said the FCC went too far by stopping state and local governments from issuing their own rules. And one item of note is the D.C. Circuit's long opinion called out at length the county's comment with respect to throttling of fire trucks by Verizon while County Fire was attempting to respond to the Mendocino complex fire. It's clear that those comments made a real impact on the way that the decision went, so that was gratifying to see. And then the final item is on Monday, a federal court judge in Southern California issued an opinion after a one-week trial that was held this past May, enjoining ICE from issuing detainers out of the ICE regional office that's located in Southern California. Now, of course, in this county, as a matter of longstanding practice and California law, the county does not respond to ICE detainers. The key impact of this opinion is that ICE can no longer even issue them in states like California, where local law enforcement agencies are not permitted to respond. So it will change the information flow.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Cortese, I've got a couple of comments and questions, but let me go to you first.
Please proceed. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Ryan. On the public charge issue, which of course is very relevant to the work we do at the county, but I fear a little obscure for members of the general public. It's my perception, and I don't have a lot of sort of data points to make the observation, but it's my perception that the notion of the administration's interest in pushing on the public charge issue seems to be broadening as the conversation continues. Forgive me, it's not very well said, but what started out as a sort of a narrow conversation about, well, if this narrower group of folks took these kinds of benefits, that might then cause some federal action, seems to be expanding to a larger and larger group of folks, and or is certainly perceived as threatening by a larger and larger number of folks. Yep. Could you just comment on that a little bit, both any facts you've got as well as any thoughts about how this is playing out?
I think that's absolutely an accurate assessment. Both the types of individuals to whom the rule applies and the types of public benefits they're trying to be barred from utilizing are expanding. And a key focus of the county's arguments in this case is not only the federal procedural requirements, that the federal government should have followed the correct statutory procedures for enacting the rule, but really a strong focus on the impact on county residents and the utilization of county services, both because of an accurate understanding of what the rule is trying to block, but also because the shifting positions of the federal government create an atmosphere of uncertainty for the community around what kinds of services will be problematic for community members to use. And so the impact sometimes is even broader than what the actual rule contemplates due to the atmosphere of fear.
Got it. On the net neutrality issue, of course, any explanation that starts with on the one hand, on the other hand is well received by me. But obvious disappointment about the thrust of the opinion, the ability of states to take action is reassuring here in California particularly. I was pleased as well, as you mentioned, that the public safety issues did get heard, because I know they were raised, by our county, but not frankly by a lot of other folks. So the fact that it got through all of that judicial conversation and clutter was heartening to me. What is it too soon to ask you? And if so, we can get a off-agenda report or bring it to the next meeting. So what is that likely to mean in terms of our ability to ensure that public safety concerns that have been raised are still addressable, notwithstanding the general thrust of supporting the commission?
My understanding is that most commentators believe this essentially paves the way for stronger regulations like those California had in place prior to these rules purporting to take away California's authority. California, the state, is certainly taking the position that its regulations are valid again. So I think that partnership with the state on this issue will be important. To the extent we're thinking about more specific local efforts, I would be happy to talk with James about following up with you.
If you could please specific, and it could be off agenda or it could be at the next meeting, and I'll ask my staff to coordinate. But I think, our law enforcement folks, particularly fire, and we had a hearing in these chambers about that issue. We're very explicit about the potential adverse consequences of the rule as interpreted, and I guess the question I would pose is, and again, not for today because we're just sort of breaking news, but is, will California state law give us enough assurance so that, frankly, it sort of negates the need to think more specifically about public safety, or will there be things in the public safety arena in terms of the ability to access and move information in a timely fashion that we will want to do as a county over and above what might be otherwise available from state law? Or are there provisions of state law that do not exist that we might want to advocate for? So I hope that gives you some clarity about my lack of clarity and where I'm hoping we can get a little more clarity going forward now that with a little more time to review the decision. And then, did I understand you correctly that the case in Southern California around detainers and ICE has statewide implications, or so that we sort of know what the lay of the land is a little more clearly now?
That's right. Actually, it even has broader implications. The injunction only applies to the activities of ICE agents who are located within the Central District of California Federal Court, which is essentially Los Angeles, Orange County, Ventura County, that region. But because the ICE office that's located in that district issues detainer requests to actually a total of 42 states, including throughout California, that means that their ability to issue those requests is much broader than just their own location, if that makes sense.
Which means that the impact of the decision is much broader than just the Central District.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you. Jumping back up to the net neutrality issue, if forgive me, I overlooked it. Any hunches at this point about whether or not an appeal will be forthcoming and or whether or not our county might be party to such an appeal? My understanding is that the appeal could go to a larger group of folks in the same circuit and or to the Supreme Court. Can you forgive me for bouncing back to a prior item, but
I don't have a hunch about that, only because it was a mixed decision. And so seeking, as you said, a review of a larger panel of the DC Circuit Court called en banc review, it presumably could be something either side would do on the portions of the decision with which they're dissatisfied. I would just note that if the county were to get involved in requesting an appeal, there is a portion of the decision that is still requires further consideration. The appeals court remanded back to the FCC a piece of the effort relating to the FCC's failure to adequately address and consider the public safety concerns of the kind the county raised. So there is some further deliberation and work the FCC needs to do, and the decision about, on our end, whether to seek further review may depend on how that comes out.
got it. Thank you. Supervisor Cortese, anything on this item? Comments, questions?
No, I think I'm clear. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, public charge, net neutrality, and immigration issues. A lot going on in a very short time. Thank you again to the County Counsel's office for making our case on a wider scale. Much appreciated. That takes care of item number 6. That takes us to item number 7, which is the report from Prime Policy Group relating to the 2019-2020 fiscal year budget and appropriations process. And why don't we ask you to sort of pick up where you left off, Prime, if you could, please.
Sure thing, and this is Rich Mead again from Prime Policy Group. And I'm going to provide a broad overview of where things stand in the appropriations process, and then my partner Aaron will provide you an accounting of how the county's priorities have fared in the Senate appropriations markup as compared to the House passed bills. Last month, Congress passed on a bipartisan basis a continuing resolution, or CR, that funds the government until November 21st. The CR also carried a number of other extensions of programs the county cares about. For example, the Medicaid Disproportionate Share Hospital Program, or DISH, was extended until November 21st, as was the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, program. The Bipartisan Budget Act that raised the budget caps and extended the debt limit has sparked a lot of action in the Senate Appropriations Committee since it passed in early August. The committee has reported 10 of the 12 bills, and 8 of the 10 bills were reported unanimously. The Defense Appropriations Bill was reported on a strong vote with just 5 dissenting senators. The Homeland Security Bill, however, was reported on a party line vote, and that's not surprising because it had $5 billion to fund the so-called border wall in the bill. The strong bipartisan votes on these appropriations bills should help set up a relatively non-contentious floor consideration of the bills in the Senate. And we were told the Senate is going to try and attempt to package the appropriations bills as they're passed by the House to make the conference negotiations easier to complete. And we expect a significant progress to be made on appropriations bills during the next congressional work period, with the Senate returning the week after next and remaining in session till Thanksgiving, and the House just taking 1 week of recess till around the Veterans Day holiday. However, in all likelihood, another continuing resolution will be needed to take the current CR until sometime probably to the middle or end of December to complete the appropriations process. We talked about impeachment earlier, and again, it's still early to know how much of an impact that will have on the appropriations process. The Senate's the one who has more work to do than the House on this, and the Senate obviously is not involved in impeachment until the House votes to impeach the president. So I think there'll be some good progress made on the appropriations process, but it's not clear how far they'll get. Let me turn things over to Erin to report on the county's priorities.
Good morning. Just a few, I'm going to highlight several of the programs that we pay attention to on behalf of the county, and then also some other broader programs and issues that we track. First, in the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill, which was reported out of committee in the Senate on September 19th, program highlights from that bill include community development block grant, which was funded by the committee at $3.325 billion. The House passed version of that is $3.6 billion. And as a matter of reference, the FY 2019 allocated amount is $3.3 billion, so quite close to the Senate version. Build grants were funded by the committee at $1 billion, which is the same level as the House. Both are $100 million higher than FY 2019, which was set at $900 million. Home investment partnerships are funded at $1.25 billion, which is the same as current FY 2019 and the House version. So they're all three of the same. Next, the Agriculture, Rural Development, and FDA bill was also reported out on September 19th. Two highlights from that bill are the WIC program. That was funded at $6 billion in the Senate appropriations bill, which is the same number that passed the House early this summer. Current FY 2019 levels are slightly higher at $6.75 billion. SNAP is funded at $69.163 billion, which is lower than the House provided $71.1 billion, which in and of itself is $2.4 million lower than current levels. And I should also add that I will provide these numbers to Ms. Christian. Lastly, the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies bill was passed out of the Senate Appropriations Committee just last week before the Senate adjourned. The Office of Violence Against Women is funded at $500 million, which is less than the House passed level of $582.5 million. The current level FY19 that we're operating at is $497.5 million. The Crime Victims Fund, the proposed cap for FY 2020 is $3.8 billion, which is roughly the same as the current 2019 cap. The House passed version is only at $2.8 billion. And lastly, in that bill, the Victims of Trafficking Grant, the Senate Appropriations Committee provided for $85 million, which is the same as current levels, and the House version sets it at $100 million. So that wraps up that section. Next, I will give a few brief updates on some of the county's federal priorities that we are monitoring. The Title IV-E waiver program. The majority and minority committee staff on both the House Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee have worked over the past several months to craft draft legislation of what is now known as the Family First Transition Act. The plan was to introduce it before the current work break, but it was still being held at the Congressional Budget Office when Congress recessed last week. So presumably it will be introduced right after things start up again next week, in 2 weeks. And it is my understanding that the draft is supported by all the waiver counties in California. The draft proposal includes 3 provisions to help states, tribes, counties, and cities implement the Family First Prevention Services Act. Key provisions are a phase-in of the 50% well-supported requirement for prevention services reimbursement. This provision would delay this requirement for 2 years through FY 2021, and then allow spending on both supported and well-supported programs to count toward that 50% requirement in FY 2022 and 2023. In FY 2024, the requirement that 50% claims be for well-supported programs would then resume. This would allow states to receive reimbursement for a wider range of evidence-based foster care prevention programs while HHS builds up the clearinghouse. The second provision is transition funding to help states implement Family First. This provision would provide states with a total of $500 million in one-time flexible funding to support their implementation of the Families First Preventive Services Act and reduce any adverse fiscal effects due to startup costs, waiver transition, and improving foster care safety and quality. After a 3% set aside for tribes, the funding would be distributed without a match or any other reservations using the same formula as is used to distribute Deputy Tubbs Jones Child Welfare Services funding, which is part of the Social Security Act. And the third and last provision is short-term funding certainty for states with expiring waivers. This provision would provide temporary grants to states or jurisdictions with expiring waivers if they face a significant loss of funds as they transition away from child welfare waivers. The grants will be provided separately from 4E reimbursement to make up a portion of the difference between what the state receives in 4E reimbursement and the temporary guarantee level. Specifically, any state or jurisdiction with a waiver ending would be guaranteed to receive the following. In FY 2020, not less than 90% of the amount they negotiated to receive under their waiver for FY 2019, and in 2021, not less than 75% of the amount they negotiated to receive under their waiver for FY 2019. Temporary guarantee funding would be in addition to the transition funding provided to all states, and all states' transition funding would not be considered in calculating the guarantee. I also have received estimated state allocations as compiled and estimated by the Congressional Research Service based on the most recent and available data and the formula specified in the legislation. Under this scenario, it would allow for California to receive $52.8 million under the Families First Transition Act. It's important to note that this is just an estimate and that the official allocations would be calculated by the Department of HHS after enactment. I would also like to note that I attended a meeting along with representatives from other waiver counties with Representative Jimmy Panetta regarding this issue. Congressman Panetta sits on the Ways and Means Committee, so in that capacity was briefed on this draft as it was being produced, and he indicated to me that he would be signing on once it is introduced. Next up is Census 2020 funding. The continuing resolution signed by the President last week, which carries the government at current levels through November 21st, has a brief mention of the 2020 census. Amounts made available by Section 101 to the Department of Commerce for the Bureau of Census programs may be apportioned up to the rate for operations necessary to maintain the schedule and deliver the required data according to the statutory deadlines in the 2020 census program. The next step is to fund it more permanently will be addressed before November 21st. Violence against women reauthorization. As reported in the last meeting in early August, violence against women has not yet been reauthorized, but Senators Feinstein and Ernst of Iowa have been continuing their negotiations on their version of the reauthorization. Senator Feinstein is supportive of the version that passed the House last spring, although it is not a bill that would gain traction in the Senate. Senator Feinstein's intention is still that any reauthorization should have no rollback from the 2013 reauthorization and must have meaningful improvements. Negotiations on this reauthorization are still ongoing. TANF reauthorization. TANF was reauthorized to continue until November 21st under the continuing resolution. Longer-term reauthorization will have to be dealt with by November 21st. It is currently operating at the FY 2019 level of $16.5 billion. The SNAP rule, a new proposed rule released just yesterday by USDA, would change how utility deductions are calculated for SNAP recipients and would thus potentially cut $4.5 billion in benefits over 5 years. It would replace the current system, which allows states to set their own utility standards with USDA approval, and instead would set state standard utility allowances using survey data. According to reports, the department estimates that 19% of households will see a decrease in their monthly SNAP benefits under the rule. We will continue to monitor this. And lastly, one update on immigration. During the summer, as I mentioned on our last call, the House passed a bill eliminating per-country caps for employment visas. The bill has strong bipartisan support in the Senate, where the counterpart is a bill co-sponsored by Senators Mike Lee of Utah and Senator Kamala Harris. Several senators have raised concerns on nurse immigrants. However, Senator Lee has made adjustments to allow more nurse immigrants into the country, although that work in that space is still continuing. However, that bipartisanship in the Senate on that bill is progress. That's all I have for today. We're happy to answer any questions or get more information.
Thank you very much. I have a couple areas I'd like to explore in slightly greater detail, but let me again check with my colleague, Supervisor Cortese. Comments or questions before I lean in?
I would only ask for any further insight on the census funding to be had before November 21st. If you're going to cover that in your questions, I can wait.
Well, I do have some census questions, but they're not really connected to the funding issue. So why don't we go ahead and follow up on that one? Supervisor Cortese, request of Prime, I gather, to give us sort of keep us in the know about the funding on census.
Yeah, I mean, what I heard was there'll be a permanent, source of funding. That sounded pretty certain by November 21st. Somebody seems to be certain about that. But is there any indication what that's going to look like relative to the 50 states and, sort of the distribution? Is this a token, or are we expecting that people are coming around to authorize, significant census funding? I guess I'm wondering how politicized it is. This is what I'm really saying.
And this is Rich Mead again to jump in. The provision that my colleague Aaron mentioned that was in the continuing resolution, that's what we call an anomaly. And so there are certain programs like the census and some others that don't fare well under a straight line, just continued funding, because the Census Bureau funding needs to ramp up. So what was included in the continuing resolution allows the Department of Commerce to ramp up spending on the census. In addition to that, there's a $2.5 billion carve-out for the census as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act. So they'll get that on top of the regular appropriation. So we are fairly confident that the census will be fully funded in the regular appropriations bill that potentially could get wrapped up by November 21st or shortly thereafter. While there's been controversy and political maneuvering around that issue previously, it seems as though we've sort of moved beyond that, and I think that's going to be fully funded and fully operational.
Thank you. That's very helpful. That's exactly what I was asking. And just the only follow-up is when you say fully funded, commensurate with past efforts. Obviously, that would include some sort of, I guess, back of the envelope inflation factor for 10 years ago. But I mean, are we in the ballpark of what? Are we talking about the same kind of dollars that have been invested in the past, going back to 2000, or do you know?
Yeah. So the calculation to add that $2.5 billion additional monies was to take into account the full cost of doing it in this day and age, the current environment. So I think it's a robust estimate, and we don't anticipate any hiccups based upon funding with the census.
All right, great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Mr. Mead and Ms. Dorton, this is Supervisor Smitty, and again, if I could, following up on Supervisor Cortese's request for information, Supervisor Cortese, might be helpful if we ask the folks at Prime to just keep us abreast of the funding on this issue so we know whether or not we're going to have the resources here in California and obviously here in the county. And Mr. Mead and Ms. Dorton, if that's something you could just be in touch with our office staffs about, just with an off-agenda memo or email, as well as Ms. Christian, obviously, as our liaison to your shop, that would be helpful. Okay?
Absolutely.
And then, not so much for today's conversation, but interestingly, each of us has our own feedback from our constituencies. I'm getting more than anecdotal interest and concern about the survey that is already out, and forgive me, I'm forgetting the name of the, Supervisor Cortese, do you remember the name of the document?
I just know it was a pre-survey.
Yeah, which is fairly extensive in terms of the information. Go ahead, somebody. Well, I will follow up with both with Ms. Christian and my office and with Prime. But I think, we have talked repeatedly about the importance of getting a full count, a full and fair count for our county, and why that's in the interest of the people we represent. And I'm frankly a little anxious that the initial survey document is pushing people away from the process. And just want to have some conversation and frankly, a better understanding on my part about what that process is and what is actually, Ms. Christian, what's actually required, quote unquote, as opposed to requested. And I'll follow up through my office staff who are, I see, taking copious notes here. So that's a piece of the census that's of particular interest to me. And then, Ms. Dorton, if I could take you and your team back to the conversation about SNAP. Forgive me, the days and weeks are running together on this seemingly never-ending push and pull around the SNAP program, but there was a sort of a crisis moment or a threat within the last year, if I remember correctly. Can you take us back to that time? Are you remembering?
That had to do with eligibility requirements?
Yeah. And things were sort of held up for a while there was some back and forth about that. Am I remembering this?
Yes. Oh, that was, if I'm remembering right, that was the Farm Bill was held up.
Thank you. That's what I'm recalling.
The SNAP eligibility on the House side.
Got it.
If I'm right. Yeah.
Thank you. Was the Farm Bill. And it doesn't sound like you feel that the SNAP program is under a full-scale assault. It sounds like what we're talking about is some of the usual back and forth about at what level of funding, but this issue about utility calculations, which is really in the deep weeds for, again, most members of the public, does have, as I understand it, pretty significant potential impacts on a significant number of folks with, real impact in terms of their budgets and their access. Is that where we stand? Yes? No?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. And that rule was just released yesterday, proposed rule was just released yesterday. So we can look into getting more information on that as time goes by.
Thank you. And I apologize to the County Counsel's office because, again, I'm trying to draw some, you all have so much going on. Have we taken formal action to provide comments? I can't remember. Because I know this subject has been out there in the ether of late, but have we taken formal action to provide comments? Ms. Christian, do you happen to recall?
Yes, actually we did. I believe the comments were submitted last week, and they were comments related to, and I'm going to describe this a little inaccurately, but a streamlined process for determining eligibility. As I understand it, a number of states use an option that allows food stamp eligibility to be determined on the receipt of other public aid programs, and the proposed rule would retract that. So I think that, as well as the adjustment on the utility deduction, demonstrates there's an effort to reduce the number of people who are receiving basic food nutrition assistance.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go right
Sure.
ahead.
No, that's what I was just going to say.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but this is pretty basic stuff in terms of ability of households to survive, and the irony, of course, is that food stamps, SNAP, CalFresh, whatever name we want to use, has always been the beneficiary of bipartisan support because you got ag interests as well as folks concerned about people of modest means who are sort of in the pushing in the same direction, which is helpful. But if I could ask Ms. Christian, working with Prime, if you could get us a little bit more information on that topic, just about sort of where things stand, what role we have played or are playing, and forgive me, even if it's a repeat of something we've already received, I wouldn't mind getting it again, with a sort of, all right, here's where we are today and here's where we think we're headed. And Ms. Narayan, if I can ask you to work with the team on that, I do want to make sure that we stay engaged on this issue. I mean, it's so basic and fundamental or foundational. And Supervisor Cortese, I don't know if the Children, Seniors, and Families Committee has had this item on its agenda or has the bandwidth for it, but again, I think it's pretty basic for every family that have their essential nutrition needs met. So let's stay. If you can keep us fully informed. Sounds like the staff and the County Counsel's office are already doing good work, but coordinating with the folks at Prime, I just want to highlight that one today among the many, many issues that Ms. Dorton reviewed. All right, thank you very much. Anything else on item number 7 before we move to item number 8, which is the report from the County Executive's Office regarding health policy and the budget landscape, including, and this was a function of a request from our full board. I think Supervisor Chavez was the one that leaned in and said, hey, we're hearing so much from the president about homelessness issues and a sudden engagement of a sort on that issue. So who'd like to begin? Are we going to turn to you, Mr. Herzog, or are we going to go back to Ms. Christian for the... Ms.
Christian.
Great. No, that's all right. Thanks.
Yes, I'm actually going to ask Bert Margolin to begin the report.
All right. Mr. Margolin, when the going gets tough, we go to you and the folks at Prime. So here you are again. Go to it.
All right. Thank you very much. So as Prime Policy has already reported, the impeachment inquiry is having a profound effect on events in Washington, but it's still unpredictable as to how much of an effect and in what direction. As far as health issues are concerned, as we've discussed in the past, there have been bipartisan negotiations on a wide range of health issues where there's actually been, until recently, progress made, restrictions on surprise billing, efforts to reduce the price of drugs, efforts to extend funding for a range of health programs, grants for community health centers, and others, delaying the implementation of cuts to the DISH program. All of these issues were being worked on. Some were more challenged than others in the negotiation, but progress was being made. But now with impeachment, it's hard to know how much progress can be made on these issues in the weeks to come. Senator Grassley, for instance, who's the lead in the Senate on drug pricing, actually said right after the impeachment inquiry was unveiled last week that he thought as he put it, we'd probably get to drug pricing next year, already deferring on the issue. Speaker Pelosi, as Prime Policy has already reported, in her comments this morning at her press conference, expressed an interest in continuing on with her drug pricing negotiations. And then around the same time, the president tweeted that the speaker is incapable, as he put it, of working on drug pricing. So hard to know how this is going to play out, except that unlike 1998, 1999, when in the Clinton administration, we were able, as Prime Policy also reported, to see a lot of productive work get done, even with an impeachment underway, and similar progress was made on issues during the Nixon impeachment. The Trump administration is structured much differently. The key decision-making on the big issues is really consolidated with the president, and to the extent the president is personally preoccupied, it becomes much more challenging for any progress to be made. The Washington Post this morning had as its lead headline, Administration Congress ramp up impeachment war. So again, this is not simply an impeachment inquiry in many respects. If you look at the president's 100-plus tweets and comments by Democrats in the Congress and others, this is a very intense conflict, the likes of which we really haven't seen before, since every other impeachment took weeks, months, years to kind of gradually unfold. We went from kind of 0 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour in the space of a week, and we're into uncharted territory. So unpredictable period, very unstable. As far as the budget's concerned, as Prime Policy mentioned, there's a CR operating through November 21. We know that the Senate's trying to work hard on getting a deal on the budget done by the end of the year. Senator Shelby actually went to the White House last Friday to ask the president if he was still committed in the middle of the impeachment process to a budget agreement. He said yes at that time, but there is the possibility of continuing CRs throughout the year if, in fact, the budget process goes off the rails. The next issue I want to touch on is public charge, which, again, County Counsel has already addressed. As County Counsel reported, there's a hearing actually today on the effort to get an injunction to stop public charge, which is scheduled to take effect on October 15th from moving ahead. There is a second proposed rule related to public charge that may come out in the middle of October, which deals with the issue of deportation based upon public charge status. We think we haven't seen it yet, being drafted rather narrowly, but again, the problem with public charge, no matter how narrowly or broadly any of these provisions are drafted, is that they create fear and anxiety on the part of the immigrant community, and fewer people choose to access the services to which they are otherwise lawfully eligible. And that's the issue here. It isn't always the black letter of what the rule or proposed rule says. It's the fear that it engenders, and that's what we're going to have to confront. Another issue we've been tracking is the Affordable Care Act litigation, the effort in Texas versus the United States to overturn the Affordable Care Act. There was a decision in favor of overturning the ACA rendered in the Fifth Circuit. It's currently on appeal. Oral arguments were heard in July. We're still waiting for that appellate panel to tell us whether or not the Affordable Care Act is going to be overturned. Still an issue for us to keep on our radar. The biggest issue out there in the coming months that's going to affect public hospital systems in California, specifically Santa Clara counties, is the renewal of the Medicaid waiver. The state is in the early stages of kind of positioning itself for a negotiation with CMS, with the federal government. The next big event in this process is going to occur on October 29th, when the state is going to have a stakeholder meeting where they will review at a high level their plans for the waiver. They're also going to advance their concept for something called CalAIM, which is an effort by the state to use the waiver and other legislation to fundamentally reform the state's Medicaid system. They want to elevate the use of managed care, promote value-based payments over volume-based payments, do lots of things to change the way Medicaid operates, and they're doing this concurrent with the waiver negotiation. So again, it will get complex over the next few months because you're going to have a waiver renewal request with certain provisions right alongside a CalAIM process designed to use that same waiver and other provisions of law to change the Medicaid program. This is the first time that the state has tried to do a broader reform at the same time they were negotiating a Medicaid waiver, and we'll see how that plays out, and we'll learn much more on October 29th. And the last issue I want to touch on is the homelessness issue, which you've already referenced, Supervisor Simitian, and you and your colleagues have an interest in. This interest is triggered by comments made by President Trump and others about the way in which California is addressing the homelessness issue. The president recently visited California, and just before he arrived, a report he had asked for by the Council of Economic Advisors was released, which addressed the issue of homelessness. And the report focused on homelessness being a problem that was largely the result of too much regulation, too many restrictions on development, and the basic theme of this report was you have to reduce these development restrictions, and if you do that, you end up with the homelessness issue addressed in a serious manner. There have been many. So the president had that report released, then came out to California, commented on homeless encampments that he saw, made a series of provocative statements. There were news articles around the same time talking about an internal agency process directed possibly going after homeless encampments in California, citing, in the case of Health and Human Services, the risk of disease as the basis for raising these encampments and creating housing facilities for these individuals. So on the issue of these reports about raising the camps and the federal government developing a strategy to become engaged with this process, based upon what I and my colleague Angie Melvin Washington have been able to learn, we haven't come across anyone in Washington who has advanced or is aware of a legal theory that would give the federal government the jurisdiction to appropriately engage in this kind of activity. If there's a risk of disease, it's a public health issue, which inherently is a local community issue, public health department question, maybe a question for the state of California. And certainly in very extreme circumstances, based upon state or county or city request, it could involve the federal government, but it's hard to envision a scenario where the federal government can proactively engage in anything remotely like what the president and his people have talked about, certainly not without the consent of local government and arguably not without a request first from local government. And if they attempt at some point to advance policy based upon some novel or new legal theory, again, you're going to see litigation almost immediately because based upon the work we've done and the research we've done, there does not appear to be a basis for this kind of intervention in local decision making on how to deal with homelessness. Where the federal government does have leverage and where they are exercising it is the use of federal dollars, the ability to deny federal dollars. And that's already occurred last week when Governor Newsom's request for 50,000 additional housing vouchers was rejected by Ben Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Secretary Carson said California has all these restrictive development policies, again, consistent with arguments advanced in the Council of Economic Advisors report. He basically said, we're not giving you this additional federal money because you created the problem based upon your development policies. Address that first, and then we'll talk about giving you additional money. So they do have the ability to deny money and play hardball as they did with Governor Newsom's request for housing vouchers, but the kind of proactive intervention without county, city, state consent seems not realistic, not feasible, and not likely to happen. That completes my report. I'm happy to respond to questions or comments.
I have a couple. Let me just ask if Prime, before we go to the supervisors, if Prime has anything they want to add, highlight, underscore, offer a different take on. That was a very wide-ranging and comprehensive report. Thank you. But let me see, Prime, anything else on that set of issues?
The only other issue, this is Rich Mead from Prime Policy. The only other issue we'll add is that EPA Administrator Andy Wheeler sent a letter to Governor Newsom sort of warning about contaminants in the water from the homeless, and so there's some threats made by EPA towards the state of California based upon water pollution.
I guess I do have one other thing to add, which is just sort of the way that I've interpreted sort of the political context on this, which is it seems like it's in some ways an effort by the president to also sort of shame large democratic states with large homeless populations. And so I think a lot of it is, I think some of it is driven not from a sincere care about the homelessness problem, which in California has increased, as you all know, exponentially over the last 10 years. But I definitely gather that there's a real political motivation here as well.
Thanks. Supervisor Cortez, do you mind if I lean in on this one? Thanks. Let's stay on the homeless issue for a minute. Mr. Margolin, you anticipated the questions I was going to ask. So, walking away, one of the questions I had was, well, what's the federal authority here? And the short version is that to date, there doesn't appear to be any articulated authority to step in or raise a camp or take that kind of action. There is always the ability to threaten at least withholding funds. And I think it was Mr. Mead who said, and by the way, there may be some interesting notions about how to use environmental regulation as an enforcement tool. So that's helpful, frankly, in understanding what the range of possibilities is or isn't. A tougher question is this a real thing, or is this just an occasion where the president has, shot from the hip a little bit, and this may or may not be a real thing next month or the month thereafter? Do we know, or is it too soon to tell again in the uncertain climate we're working in?
So I think it is a real thing in the sense, and I agree with the comment just made about there being a political dimension to this, in that it is triggered in part or based in part on this Council of Economic Advisors report that the president requested several months ago. So it wasn't a momentary, he didn't read the newspaper one morning and start to tweet about homelessness or go on a tour of a city and then make a quick off-the-cuff remark. I mean, some of that is going on. Obviously, the president's very reactive to what he sees, but this Council of Economic Advisors report took a fair amount of work. It's very controversial. They, for instance, in this report, sort of question the value of permanent supportive housing for people with disabilities, saying there's no evidence that works, when in fact almost all the evidence out there suggests it does work and is of value. So there's a lot of substance to that report, much of it again controversial, and it is going to be a theme. It has a political dimension to it, as was just mentioned, but I don't think it's going to go away overnight. There's, again, we talked before about with public charge, the fear factor with the immigrant community. Again, there's an effort here to, as was said, shame big cities, intimidate them. This EPA letter, I'm guessing, I haven't seen it, is probably linked to some threat, implicit threat or explicit, to withhold federal funds at some point that the EPA has control over. So this isn't going to go away, I don't think.
Thanks. Prime, anything else on that question?
No, and we agree with that.
Thanks.
Assessment in terms of this not going away.
Thank you. I think we'll ask our team, again, Ms. Christian, to sort of keep on top of this issue and just even between meetings, if there's a brief off-agenda worthy development, that I think that would be helpful. I did want to go back to the Medicaid conversation, Mr. Margolin, and now it's my turn to do my on the one hand, on the other hand. As you were talking about the waiver process and the fact that that is concurrent with, if I understood it correctly, concurrent with some interest in California in reforming the Medicaid system, you know, my reaction is that on the one hand, you know, if we're going to be in the midst of a waiver, what better time to think about, all right, so what should that waiver look like and what are the possibilities for useful reform? On the other hand, my reaction is, my God, it's challenging enough to make a waiver process work without saying, by the way, while we're trying to do that, let's redesign the system. Thoughts about my on the one hand, on the other hand, my reaction to that?
Well, I've had a very similar reaction in that at first I thought waiver negotiations are complicated enough. Why is the state taking on this more complex undertaking? But in thinking about it some more and seeing what the state has had to say, there is a logic to doing it. First of all, we have a new governor, Governor Newsom, who, unlike any prior governor, probably since the passage of Medicaid in '65, I think it's probably fair to say this is true, has a very strong interest in health care and has made it a lead item for his administration. And he's now at the end of his first year in the governorship, and he wants to use his first 4 years, to tackle big issues, and one of those big issues is Medicaid. So it's hard, if you're in the governor's chair thinking about it from his perspective, why would he defer his larger reform efforts until after the waiver when he has this first term to get things done? So you sort of see the logic of that. The other logic for doing both things, although it's complicated, is this waiver is going to be a smaller waiver, the state is telling us, with less money for California, for a range of technical reasons, and in addition to other reasons. And because it's less money for public health systems, they're trying to reform Medicaid in a way that will provide public hospital systems with other sources of revenue, primarily through managed care payments. That's the current thinking. So reinventing how managed care is structured, how managed care organizations in Medicaid operate. At the same time, you're reducing the size of the waiver. There is a logical connection there, because they've got to figure out a way to sustain public hospital systems, and at the same moment, the waiver is getting smaller. So there's that connection as well. So Newsom agenda, governor wants to think big, do big things, and then a smaller waiver. Both are factors why this is going on the way it is.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I apologize for, again, jumping back both for Prime and for you, Mr. Margolin, on the issue of homelessness issues and the President's articulated concerns about our regulatory environment here in California. You know, we all have our views about the regulatory climate here in California, but there is one point that seems to be overlooked in most of these discussions, which is that somehow we have been managing to create very significant amounts of commercial development to respond to the booming economy and the jobs that creates, and that the challenge is with residential development. And you know, most of the regulatory issues, I'm thinking particularly of CEQA here, that California Environmental Quality Act, most of the regulatory issues are more or less the same, whether you're trying to, you know, do a tilt-up building in an industrial park or whether you're doing single-family residential or multifamily residential homes. And so my point is that before we load all of the burden on our regulatory environment, we might ask ourselves, well, how come our regulatory environment allows us to build when it comes to commercial development, but not residential development? My own view, and not everyone agrees, I know that, my own view is that it's a function of the fiscalization of land use, a phrase that I know you remember, Mr. Margolin, from back in the day, which doesn't get much discussed these days. But you know, there are real financial incentives for communities to approve commercial development and not so much for residential development. But as I say, I want as that if and that debate continues, I just want to make sure our teams are mindful of the fact that somehow we're managing to build a lot. It's just not residential; it's commercial, and that laying all that at the foot of our regulatory environment, regulatory climate, might be wide of the mark. Supervisor Cortese, comments or questions on any of these items that we've just heard about under item number 8?
No, I think we've done a thorough job of
Thank you.
getting through it. Thank you.
All right, then last words, if any, before we move to adjournment. Folks at Prime, thank you. Anybody there? All good?
We're here.
All right. Mr. Margolin, anything else? Any one more thing?
Nothing further, thank you.
All right. Well, then we'll thank you all very much. Very, very thorough, very helpful. And I feel like in the space of an hour before we let you go, however, I do want to turn to Mr. Pike from Congressman Khanna's office.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you again for this opportunity, because this gives us a great chance to hear what the concerns of county are, and I report directly to the congressman. So we appreciate this.
Thank you for being here. And I've had the same thought, which is, understanding everybody's got too many things to do and too many places to be. I hope that you find the hour or so that you spend here a relatively efficient way to sort of get a sense of what's on our list of things to be anxious about and or supportive of as we work in tandem with your office and other members of Congress. Then I think that wraps it, folks. Without objection and hearing none, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to Mr. Herzig and Ms. Narayan for pinch hitting today.